We're going to go over the background of the American Revolutionary War today. So this isn't going to be uncovering every part of the American Revolutionary War. We're just going to cover some general background information. So that way you have an understanding of why the war started, but specifically when the war started, why we decided as a country to come up with the form of government that we had after the Revolutionary War, which is still in effect today. So we're going to go over some background info so you have some idea of where the country was going at the time. Some of the words might get cut off. I'm sorry about that, but I'm going to try to adjust things as needed. All right, so the American Revolution, that happened from 1775 to 1783. The Revolutionary War is also known as the American Revolution because a lot of countries can have a Revolutionary War, so we have to call it the American Revolution. The war was fought between the British and the colonists who live in the United States. The result of the American Revolution was a new nation called the United States of America. Here were some of the events that were leading up to the Revolution. The first one is something called the Navigation Acts of 1756. A lot of these were laws that were passed in England that basically made the colonists very angry. So because of that, they decided to break off from England and had the Revolutionary War. So all these things that have the word act in them, they're usually just laws that were created in England. So King George III used an old law to make the colonists pay taxes on goods shipped in English ships. The colonists responded by smuggling goods. Okay, so he basically made it so anything that was sent over from England, that the colonists would have to pay for it. But this was also at a time where most of their things would have to come from England because they didn't have a lot of industry in the United States yet because it was so new. So even though some of these items were essential and they were sent from England, they would have to, in the United States, have to pay taxes just because they sent it over on the boat. So the colonists responded by stealing some of those items and getting them off the boat. The French and Indian War happened before the Revolutionary War, which was from 1754 to 1763. The British won the French and Indian War, but because they spent so much money on the war, they decided to tax the colonies for defending them in the war. So they basically blamed the colonists, saying like, oh, well, we had a war on your land. Because that cost us so much, you guys have to pay for it. Sorry. Writs of assistance. The king angered the colonists again by enacting something called the writs of assistance. A writ is also another law, which was another old law. This allowed the use of general search warrants, which let them search anyone, anytime, anywhere. And the colonists were very angry and they protested. So the writs of assistance, all of those goods that people were smuggling off the boats, they decided to make it so they could search any place, any home, anybody for any reason, whenever they wanted. And that colonists got upset because it was basically British troops just searching people when they felt like it. In 1763, the colonists had enjoyed a great amount of freedom. They resented the new orders issued by the king and of being taxed without their consent. So all of these taxes, nobody had asked the colonists if they were okay being taxed or if they agreed with the idea of taxing them. These were just laws that were passed without their consent. The Sugar Act, which was another law of 1764. The Sugar Act actually lowered taxes from the Molasses Act, but was more strictly enforced than the Molasses Act. Okay, so literally this is people being taxed on sugar. So the Molasses Act was a sugar tax basically beforehand, but nobody really held anyone to it. The Sugar Act made it so if you were buying sugar, you had to pay a lot of money for those items in taxes. The Stamp Act of 1765, that placed taxes on any articles written on paper. So any paper, literally a piece of paper that you might use, you would have to pay taxes on that. So if you made newspapers, if you had a will drawn up, if you had a license or a deed or a pamphlet or anything that was written on paper, you were taxed heavily for using paper. All right, here are some of the steps of the revolution. You have the Proclamation of 1763. The colonists started getting angry at this point. Then you have the Sugar Act in 1764. People start smuggling things, so they start stealing things like sugar. You have the Stamp Act, and the Stamp Act and the Congress started creating something called the Sons of Liberty, where they start going against the British rule, and they start kind of talking about having a revolution at this point. You just keep going from there. So there's some more events after it. The Stamp Act of 1765. The colonists responded by creating the Stamp Act Congress and refused to buy stamps or stamped paper. They also burned pictures of the king in effigy. So they basically started to protest, and they also decided to boycott and not buy any of these items that they were going to be taxed on. The Quartering Act of 1765 said that colonists must provide salaries, so money, housing, and supplies for British soldiers. The colonists did not agree and did not obey. So this is like having a bunch of military troops from Canada come to the United States, and our government has basically decided, well, all the troops that are here, we're going to start sending them to people's homes. So you have to pay their money, you have to feed them, you have to clothe them, and you also have to have them live in your house. So you just have random troops showing up to your house and living with you, and you have to pay for them. So obviously the colonists were not happy about that. The Townshend Acts of 1767. Another act, the Townshend Acts of 1767, placed taxes on glass, lead, paint, and tea, and was used to pay salaries of colonial officers, including governors and judges. In response, the colonists boycotted all British goods. So they just kept taxing more items, but this time the money went to British people who were put in as governors and judges in order to pay for their salaries. All right, we're getting closer to the Revolution. We covered these. So as we're going through them, you're going to see the Townshend Acts of 1767. You start getting more boycotts. And then suddenly we have violence. So violence erupts as British troops are sent to Boston in 1768. This leads to something called the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre, it occurred on March 5th, 1770. It happened as tensions between colonists and redcoats peaked. So redcoats are another word for British troops. The townspeople pushed to the customs house, and the British Guard called for help as colonists were crowding. Okay, so you basically have these two groups of people who are here, and they're getting ready, kind of tensions are bubbling up. They're yelling at each other. They're not being good. A crowd of colonists began to throw stones, wood, etc. at the soldiers, and several soldiers were knocked down. The soldiers then fired shots at the crowd, and several colonists were killed. The riot was used as propaganda by the colonists. So propaganda, the colonists took the story and said, look at how evil these British troops are. They kill colonists for no reason. Here is a picture or a painting of the bloody massacre that was perpetuated in King Street. So you can see here, if you look at the British troops who have the guns, do you see how they're standing and they don't look like they're remotely injured or hurt at all? And then you can see all the colonists. They're running away. Some of them are dead in the streets. Some of them are slumped over and being held up by each other. So this is part of that propaganda, kind of showing that the British were fine and the colonists were suffering. Fallout from the Boston Massacre. Crispus Attucks was the first colonist killed. He was of African-American descent. The British soldiers were put on trial in Boston, and they were defended by John Adams. Adams argued that the shootings occurred as a result of self-defense, and they were found to be innocent. Because remember, the British troops did have rocks and things that were thrown at them, right? And they were being screamed at and antagonized. So what his argument was that the British troops felt very threatened and they had to defend themselves. All right, so we have, once again, all of these items going back up, and now we're going to have the Boston Massacre as another major event. All right, on July 9th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was written, and it was read for the first time in New York in front of George Washington and his troops. In reaction to what had been read, soldiers and citizens went to Bowling Green, a park in Manhattan where a lead statue of King George III on horseback stood. The mob of people pulled down the statue, and later the lead was melted down to make musket balls or bullets that were used in the War for Independence. All right, that is it. Make sure you finish up your Ed puzzle.